You are Locked On Kentucky, your daily podcast on the Kentucky Wildcats. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, what's going on, Big Blue Nation? Welcome on into Locked On Kentucky, your daily Kentucky Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Lance Dawe, writer for USA Today for various SEC-related things, but on this podcast specifically, we take a dive into all things Kentucky athletics. On today's episode, we are joined by a very special guest, Sean Vinsel of Hoops Insight, going to be breaking down the Kentucky versus Tennessee matchup happening on Saturday. Sean, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Lance. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So let's just go ahead and get into it. Kentucky, Tennessee on Saturday. It's going to be a really fun game. The Vols defensively strong right now, offensively in a little bit of a dry spell. Overall, before we get into this matchup, I've not gotten to talk to you about this Kentucky team. I know you do fantastic work at Hoops Insight, breaking down numbers and things with the Wildcats in your newsletters. But what are your overall thoughts of this Kentucky team?
Yeah, I'd say my first thought is that I think this team absolutely deserves a place, kind of in the top 10, maybe even top 5 in the country. They definitely don't have that standout win yet. And I think some of that is, early in the season. For example, the Duke game, it just probably wasn't quite the right time for them to gel. But Kentucky's had a number of really strong performances. And I think the fact that they've had some of their stronger performances against, really other than the North Carolina game, against teams that aren't great, that doesn't tend to give them the credit they deserve. But they've consistently really been able to blow out teams. A few games they've actually given some points back in garbage time, like the Vandy game. They got out to a 28-point lead and gave 12 of that back. But honestly, I don't even look at garbage time when I do analysis because what happens at the end of these blowouts has nothing to do with anything going forward or anything. So I think Kentucky's a little bit underrated. And I think that the key for me is they've had a tremendous offense this year. Really, it even goes beyond. But really, if you look at kind of their core 7 players, being kind of whoever starts, and then usually Minson topping off the bench. Assuming Wheeler starts too. When Kentucky plays with that group, they are absolutely blitzing teams. They have an offense that is would be number 1 in the country, and it's in not an insignificant number of possessions. So it's really impressive, and it's for the first time in Calipari's tenure, they've really been able to spread the floor, create driving lanes, get to the rim, and then with Oscar Tshiebwe underneath, they're amazing. I mean, Kentucky, I haven't checked lately. They've been bouncing back and forth between either number 1 or number 2 in the nation in field goal percentage at the rim, which is a huge win for them because last year Kentucky was very poor at that, but that's usually a strength, and that's a sign that Calipari's offense is doing some of the things he wants to do. Those are high percentage shots, and that's really, really powering things. So I think that they're definitely offensive led, but their defense is certainly no slouch. But I'm most impressed that they've been able to transition to a different style of offense this year.
Yeah, and I love what you pointed out there, just talking about the consistency and efficiency of this offense. And while I believe Vanderbilt held Kentucky to 78 points, which is underneath their Kentucky's average points per game, you put out a tweet. I don't remember if it was yesterday or today, just talking about how outside of garbage time, Kentucky was actually really efficient in that game, and it was I believe their 3rd best game of the season in terms of offensive efficiency. So the Wildcats have been really consistent. Like you mentioned, I think they have started to gel as the season has gone on. To start this breakdown between Kentucky and Tennessee, I want to talk about the offense first for the Volunteers and then get to the defense, which is obviously Tennessee's strength. Just some numbers here for everybody real quick. Tennessee averaging 75.3 points per game. Their pace of play slightly above average. They put up a lot of shots. They are 3rd in the SEC in field goal attempts per game, and they take a lot of threes, 28 per game, which is 2nd in the SEC. So last game, Kentucky was dealing with an offense that knew how to create in isolation and knew how to put up a lot of threes. This offense spreads the ball around a little bit more. They're actually 1st in the SEC in assists per game, and they shoot a lot of threes. What particularly have you seen out of this Tennessee offense this season? I know they're in a little bit of a slump right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I look at the numbers kind of across their offense, there's nothing that really stands out as they're really good at this. I mean, the biggest area, I think the biggest thing that pushes them on offense is just the fact that they get a lot of steals, and those tend to be really easy to convert into points. But when you look at like their half court offense, they've definitely got a very good shot distribution. They shoot a lot of threes and a lot of shots at the rim. that's where you tend to get efficient offense. But they're actually not very good at shooting either one. They're outside, I believe, the top 100 in both areas, which, for a team that is in a major conference, I think they'd probably either be really good at the rim or from three. They're not really. Something interesting, though, is they do have a number of players who are at least pretty solid from three, in that 35% range, something like that. You have Kenny Chandler, you got Justin Powell. They do have a bit of a stretch four, although he hasn't taken very many 3-point shots, but I'm not sure to pronounce his name. Kamua, I think, is 11 for 22. So that's a real threat if you look at a team that can stretch the floor and take good distribution of shots, because the fact is they don't need a good shooting night, hitting a high percentage to be able to translate those into points. So I think that's probably the scariest thing for Kentucky overall, is just that, Tennessee's going to take a solid approach, but no real stars and standouts that I think you need to worry about quite as much.
You talk about not necessarily having stars. I will give you here, though, 3 contributors that I think Kentucky fans should watch out for, not necessarily because they're going to match up well with the Wildcats, just guys that have been playing well for them this season. John Fulkerson, averaging 9 points a game for the Vols so far this season. He's been at Tennessee since Peyton Manning graduated in 1997. At least it feels like it. He's been there for forever. He's 8 points away from scoring 1,000. You would like to imagine that he gets that in this game. Santiago Vescovi, averaging 13.6 points per game. You talked about a couple of guys that are consistent from beyond the arc. I believe Santiago shooting right at or a little bit over 35% from three. He also leads the team in 3-point attempts. The next closest player has 66 as opposed to his 119 that he has jacked up this season. And then Kennedy Chandler, somebody that you mentioned there, a little over 13 points per game and about 5 assists per game. Is there a guy on this team that offensively you think could give the Wildcats fits, or is it just simply going to be a team effort?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chandler's probably the standout in terms of NBA draft profile, and he's definitely, he takes the highest percentage of their shots, and you always worry when you get a guy who's got the ball in his hands and who can shoot from three, but also, is pretty crafty and quick. He's probably the guy that I think most people would recognize as being, difficult to deal with. But I actually probably am a little bit more worried about one guy you mentioned there, John Fulkerson. I think a lot of Kentucky fans still have some PTSD from, I think it was like 3 years ago, when he basically fouled out Kentucky's entire team, drew something like 11 fouls in the game. He isn't drawing fouls at quite that high of a rate this year, but offensive rebounding, drawing fouls, he's always dangerous inside. And obviously, when you look at Oscar Sheboy, that's something you worry about as a center that can draw fouls on him. And second, I think, is the Tennessee's got a lot of guys who are going to fire up threes. Josiah Jordan-James takes, I think 3/4 of his shots are from three. Justin Powell can shoot from three. Vescovi obviously takes a ton of threes, both in just raw numbers and the percentage of his shots. I worry a little bit about some of the catch and shoot, or guys just off of a little bit of a maybe a defensive miscommunication on a pick and roll, or just staying open and hitting some of those threes, because Tennessee's not been a great 3-point shooting team this year, but they're going to likely shoot so many that if they can, especially if one of those kind of more role players hits a couple of them, that's going to be dangerous. I think Kentucky's going to do enough to probably contain Chandler. Kentucky tends to do very well in containing those kind of lead ball handler threats and not letting them destroy them, but I worry about what that might open up off the ball for shooters.
Well, you talk about things coming off the ball, and real quick here, I want to talk about just stylistically what this team likes to run from an X's and O's standpoint. So Rick Barnes, at least from what I could find, used to run the flex at Texas, and from what I understand, he's now kind of shifted to a motion-style offense at Tennessee. I watched some film of the Volunteers earlier. They like to get quick rim attacks. They like to use high ball screens at the top, and then they typically have different options that come off of that. And literally since I watched a lot of film, like from the 2018 season, the 19 season, and then this season, they will run the same things over and over and over and over. There's also some ball reversals that come out of that screen high at the top. They run a lot of different stuff off of just one simple motion at the beginning of an offensive possession. There's so many different things that can come from this offense. Is there something that could potentially hold the Volunteers back in this game? Because Kentucky, like you mentioned at the top of the episode, defensively, they're pretty good as well.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I'm hoping will continue for Kentucky is Kentucky's been really good at defending the rim this season, which is interesting because Kentucky doesn't have their traditional kind of long shot blockers. This year, it's a little bit more of Kentucky actually guards do a really good job of staying in front of guys. Really mostly Washington, Mintz, and Wheeler. Kelly Grady does occasionally give up some lapses on guys driving from the wing, but Kentucky's usually able to get out and close that down. Kentucky's had some, in their losses, they've had some trouble guarding the rim, but overall, Kentucky's been pretty solid keeping guys from getting there. And the last few games, Tennessee's actually really been on a pretty bad stretch, and it's a lot of those top guys. And Kennedy Chandler, the last 4 games, is hitting just 50% of his shots at the rim, where you'd expect a quality guard to be finishing about 65% there, and he's 22% from 3. He's also taking basically every game the most of the second most shots when he's in the game. And so he's been really inefficient. Jordan James has been just 25% from 3 the last 4. He's not shooting very well, so he doesn't really get to the rim all that much. So what I'd look for Kentucky to do is if they can continue those, first of all, if those struggles for Tennessee really, especially shooting at the rim, are real, and Kentucky is pretty good at limiting guys getting there, I think they'll make Tennessee work a little bit more. One thing to watch for, though, is Vescovi actually has been shooting very well. He just hasn't been getting very many shots. If Kentucky kind of leaves him alone a little bit, that he may burn them. I think a couple of years ago he ended up getting up like 11 threes a couple of years ago in one of his first games against Kentucky. And so, hopefully Kentucky's kind of adjusted to take that away, and they can shut these guys down at the rim. But I always, I generally tend to look at that as an indicator of a strong defensive performance for Kentucky, and they've been doing a very solid job lately. So hoping they can keep that up.
I want to switch over to the Volunteers defense here in just a second, but before we do that, I want to tell you guys about an incredible app everyone who buys gas needs to know about, Get Upside. If you have Get Upside, as all Locked On Kentucky listeners should, then you will be making up to 25 cents for every gallon of gas every time you fill up. Just download the free Get Upside app in the App Store or Google Play right now and use promo code SCORE and get a bonus 25 cents per gallon on your first fill up. That's up to 50 cents cash back. Don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Get cash back using Get Upside. Just download the app for free and use promo code SCORE to get up to 50 cents a gallon cash back on your first tank. All right, moving along here on the Friday edition of Locked On Kentucky. Really appreciate Sean Vinsel of Hoops Insight coming on to talk a little Kentucky basketball, taking on the Tennessee Volunteers on Saturday. Want to move now to the defense here. Before we actually move on to the defense, Sean, tell everybody where they can find your great content.
Sure, yeah. The 2 places you can go. First of all, I'm on Twitter, and I'm probably on there too much. I tweet a lot. At Hoops Insight, I tend to post links to the articles that I write. Also, a lot of interesting facts. I throw up some stuff, pretty periodically, and tweet a lot during the games. Then, if you go to HoopsInsight.com, you can go there. You can subscribe to. I've got a couple different newsletters that you can subscribe to. Also, there's a link to a thing that I created this year. I call it my stats engine, where you can look at lineup stats. You can look at stats, for certain players on or off the court for Kentucky, certain games. You can look. Also, I've got Tennessee stats up there. LSU. I'll be putting a couple more SEC teams as the season goes on. So hoopsinsight.com or on Twitter at HoopsInsight.
And I'll make sure to have all of those links in the description, both on YouTube and on the podcast format, if you guys want to check Sean out. All right, the defense here for the Volunteers. They shut teams down. They're averaging 62.4 points allowed per game, which is 42nd nationally. It's obviously the strength of this team, or at least it is, in my opinion, the defense. How do they shut teams down? You mentioned the steals earlier. I'm sure that's a huge part of what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. The interesting thing is their results look very similar to LSU, actually. And I think for KenPom, I believe they rank number 1 and 2 in the country in defensive efficiency. So they force a lot of turnovers, and a lot of those are steals. Tennessee's forcing turnovers on over a quarter of opponents' possessions this year, which is tremendously high rate. Kentucky hasn't turned it over on a quarter of their possessions all season, so that would definitely be a departure if Tennessee's able to force that many. Also similar to LSU, not quite to the degree, but Tennessee does allow a lot of three-pointers. They allow opponents to shoot about 40% of their shots from 3. And but they're both teams, Tennessee and LSU, are really good at defending the rim, really allow a low field goal percentage there. So stylistically, I think some of the things that Kentucky had to adjust to at LSU are going to be actually a nice warm up. When you think about the first half against LSU, the Tigers were really swarming the paint. getting hands in there and getting a lot of deflections. Second half, Kentucky moved the ball better, got it to the outside to Grady for some open threes, and those started dropping. So I think Kentucky's able to carry that over. I think you'll see guys like Grady, Washington, Mintz be able to get some good looks from three there, but the downside is there's going to be a lot of pressure on the ball handler coming up. One good thing, though, is Calipari teams actually tend to not succumb to those high-pressure teams and turn the ball over at quite the degree you'd think. And even the LSU game, Kentucky had some turnover problems, but most of that came during those minutes when TyTy and Wheeler were both out of the game. So, assuming even if Wheeler isn't healthy enough to return, just if TyTy is able to play most of the game, I think Kentucky will actually generally be okay in avoiding those turnovers. And the other interesting thing is Kentucky's actually scored at the rim very well, even against teams that defend the rim well. Against LSU, Kentucky, kind of did about what they do, got about 70% of their shots at the rim to go in, and LSU doesn't typically allow that. So, if you've got a guy like Oscar down low, it seems like the teams can't really stop him. So hopefully Kentucky's kind of the kryptonite to go up against those strengths.
You talked about making sure that Kentucky's guards handle the ball well in this game, and I want to talk about that later on in the show. I've got some things I want to ask you about TyTy Washington, but just some overall numbers here just to break down what you were just talking about. Like you mentioned, Tennessee second in the nation in defensive efficiency according to KenPom. They're third in the SEC in steals per game, second nationally in steal percentage. They are eighth nationally in turnovers forced per game at 18.4, and a lot of the offense that they create does come off of turnovers. Is there a player on defense in particular that stands out to you? Kennedy Chandler averaging 2.3 steals per game, Vescovi averaging 2.1. Is there one guy in particular that you would say he's the catalyst for what the Vols do defensively?
There's actually one guy. It's interesting. First of all, he has a funny name, so I thought that was funny. And then when I looked, he's like 5'9". This guy's Zakai Zeigler. I honestly didn't know who he was until I started doing some of this analysis. But when I started looking at how Tennessee's played when he's in the game, they've really taken it to another level. He's only 5'9". He's a freshman. He has the highest steal rate on their team, 4.9% of possessions in his steal. That's actually a little bit higher than either Chandler or Vescovi. So if he played the amount of minutes they did, he'd probably get their steal numbers or better. And Tennessee's actually got three guys in the top 60 in steal rates between Ziegler, Vescovi, and Chandler. So that's something I'm really curious to watch. Ziegler doesn't play a ton of minutes. He plays a little under 20 minutes a game. But when he plays, they really in half court are able to put pressure on teams, get in the passing lane, get a lot of steals, a lot of turnovers. They caused havoc for Arizona earlier this year, and most of it came when Ziegler was in the game. So I'd actually watch for it, especially if they go to any sort of three-guard lineup with, because Kentucky's probably going to play some three-guard lineups. If they're playing Chandler, Vescovi, and Ziegler in the game at the same time, that could be trouble because they force a high rate of turnovers when they do that, and that is how they won their game against Arizona, for example. They just played for a few minutes, but really put it on them. South Carolina did the same thing. So that'll be really interesting to watch those three.
Zakai Zeigler, a name to watch, as well as the other two guards, putting pressure on the opposition. A statistic here for you guys, and then we can move on to some final thoughts. Going to give a final score prediction for you guys as well. I like to throw out, whenever talking about defense, so far, whenever I've done these breakdowns, so just a statistic, a cool fact about the defense. Georgia's fun fact was that they put pressure on literally nobody, and that they give up, on average, a team's points per game or higher. They're giving up about 87 in conference play right now, I think. So they defensively just kind of get pushed around by everyone. But a statistic here for Tennessee. Tennessee has played 7 teams that have an offensive efficiency in the top 100 according to KenPom. Those teams on average scored only 68.4 points per game. So Tennessee, even against some decent offenses, they have managed to shut those teams down relatively well. And they've not won all of those games, but the defense has certainly been there for the Volunteers. I want to give some final thoughts here and give a final score prediction in just a second. But before we do that, I want to tell you guys about our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this holiday season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before as football continues its march through the pro football playoffs. BetOnline remains your number one spot for all the sports action this season. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Just use our promo code LOCKEDON to receive your bonus. From basketball, football, NHL, boxing, and UFC, right to your favorite Vegas casino games, don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your favorite sports. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, wrapping up the Friday edition of Locked On Kentucky, Lance Dawe, Sean Vinsel here with you, breaking down Kentucky's matchup with the Tennessee Volunteers. Going to get some final thoughts here. Sean, Kentucky is 7-8 against Rick Barnes in Tennessee. Looking at the individual players on roster, I don't know if Tennessee has the talent in the past that can match up extremely well with Kentucky. Now, I think this is going to be a competitive game. I think it's going to be close, but they've got these different 4- and 5-star guys on roster, but it just doesn't seem like they're clicking right now, at least in non-conference play.
Yeah, I agree. It seems odd. I mean, Barnes is, like you said, heck of a coach. He's great. Got a really good team, but things just aren't really flowing very well for them in the last few games. I don't know with Chandler, being a freshman, if he hit a sort of wall or something's happening there. But the one thing you can pretty much always be sure on about Rick Barnes' teams is they're going to play hard, and he's usually going to find a way to get his team in a good position, whatever that lineup is. So if he's got 5 guys that can hang with Kentucky, I think you're going to see some good lineups play. Wouldn't be surprised to see him do some weird things like playing 4-guard lineups and things like that to attack Kentucky in all sorts of different ways and maybe put additional pressure on them. But I agree. I don't think this is quite as good of a Tennessee team as has gone against Kentucky the last few years. And I think this is probably the best Kentucky team since 2017. So I think this is a nice opportunity for Kentucky to come out with a win against a frequent nemesis.
I've set parameters around wins for Kentucky in the SEC, and I guess Kentucky doesn't have to check all 4 of these boxes, but they're good parameters for winning in the Southeastern Conference, at least for Kentucky. I want to go over the 4 things that I have that Kentucky has to do to win in the SEC, and I want to get your thoughts on it, and I want to see if you have anything to add to it. The 4 things. Number 1, Kentucky has to shoot the ball well. They don't have to shoot insanely well, but they just have to have a decent outing, whether it be right at their average field goal percentage, which I believe is somewhere 46, 47%, somewhere around there. Number 2, have decent shot selection. I have been very critical of Kentucky's shot selection, especially early on in the season. The 2-point jumper is not a shot that I'm necessarily a fan of. I know that Kentucky takes a lot of them. They knock down an average rate, and I just think that it's not a high percentage shot. I'm looking at more shots at the rim, more shots from 3 to become a more efficient offense. I think that's something that Kentucky needs to do as SEC play goes on. Third thing here, playing well in transition, both offensively and defensively. I know that Wheeler is not playing with the team right now. I actually don't know if he's even going to play on Saturday. But he is a catalyst for sure, both on the offensive and defensive end, playing well in transition. And the final thing here, something that you mentioned, protect the rim. Kentucky's been doing it well this season. If they continue to do it in SEC play, I think they're going to be just fine. So shooting the ball well, having decent shot selection, playing well in transition, and then protecting the rim. Those are my 4 things that Kentucky has to do to win in the SEC. Thoughts on that? And is there anything that you would add on to those parameters?
I think you're absolutely spot on. Those are the areas where, if you look at the difference between Kentucky's wins and losses, those are the areas where it comes in at. LSU, Kentucky took 17 mid-range shots, more shots than took at the rim or from 3, and they hit 2 of them. I mean, you're going to lose games when you do that. Duke, Notre Dame, Kentucky, and even LSU, Kentucky was bad in transition. They just didn't convert in transition in those games, and that ended up costing them. So Kentucky is even just at their normal level in transition. They've got a lot of steady things I think are gonna keep them in the game. I think the only other thing I'd add is just staying out of turnover trouble. They're going to play a lot of teams in the SEC that are going to have a lot of pesky guards like Tennessee. I think Kentucky usually does a good job, but I wouldn't be surprised if they have a game or 2 where things kind of pop up. Sometimes it's those offensive fouls, and illegal screens or things like that. But So, Kentucky's got such a good offense that a turnover is an extra penalty for them, because if they get a shot at the goal, they're going to convert at a pretty high rate. So, yeah, completely agree, though, on what you're talking about there. And if Kentucky hits those things, I think they're a contender, not just in the SEC, but nationally.
Who do you think is the most valuable player in this game for the Wildcats? Obviously, Shibwe is on a tear right now. TyTy Washington running the point for the Wildcats. Davian Mintz has been averaging 14 points a game over the past 2-game stretch. Who do you think is the most valuable Wildcat in this matchup against the Vols?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm probably going to say, I'm going to take Oscar as just a given, so I'm not going to say him. I'm going to say that he'll probably come out and have a kind of typical game. I think I'm going to go with TyTy Washington, because I think similarly, you just talked about the off the dribble jumpers and things like that are not good shots. If TyTy stays away from those and is able to generally take care of the ball, I'm not even that worried about him scoring a ton. He usually is able to get his shot, but I think if he just plays smart, I think he can help direct a lot of those stylistic things that you're talking about that make the team play well, and I think other guys will feed off of him. And if Severe Wheeler plays, I think he steps into that role. But I think TyTy's really grown into someone who can really make a lot of positive things happen for the team and direct the team. And I think if he keeps doing that, you're going to see a really solid game. And I expect the Cats to come out on top then.
I'm going to go with TyTy as well, and I went and looked at Kentucky's 3 losses this season. In those 3 losses, they averaged 6.4 assists less than their average on the season. They were averaging a little over 11 in those 3 losses, and they averaged 17.4 a game. Tennessee, like you mentioned, very good at creating steals, creating havoc. TyTy Washington is going to need to step up and make very sound decisions distributing the basketball against the Volunteers. I think that's going to be very important. And like you said, Shibwe is kind of a given, right? Given the fact that he just kind of does what he does and he scores and he gets his rebounds and he just plays well consistently. But I agree with you. TyTy Washington would be the other guy that I would go with. One more question here, and then we'll get out. Give us a final score prediction, and then tell us what will be the most important aspect of this game.
I'll go with 78 to 68. I think Kentucky's going to win. I think that the most important thing is actually going to be Tennessee's 3-point shooting. I think if Kentucky can hold Tennessee to under their season average of 32%, I think that's a really good sign. I think Kentucky tends to force teams into some bad looks from 3, and as long as those aren't kind of miraculously going in, I think Kentucky will have enough to kind of handle the Volunteers.
I will go Kentucky 75, Tennessee 66. That will be my final score prediction, just kind of hovering around that 70s to 60s range. All right, Sean, one more time, tell everybody where they can find your fantastic content over at Hoops Insight.
Sure, yeah. You can go to HoopsInsight.com, sign up for my newsletters there, or you can find me on Twitter at HoopsInsight.
All right, that's going to do it, everybody, for today's episode of Locked On Kentucky. You can follow the show on Twitter at Locked On UK. You can follow me on Twitter at Lance Dawe. You can follow the show on Instagram at Kentucky Podcast. I will see you all on Monday to hopefully recap a Kentucky Wildcats win. Have a good one, everybody, and God bless.